I am telling this story on behalf of my best friend, Tom, who I've known since childhood and who I consider a brother. He served with the Army for several years as an infantryman with the 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. As he returned from his combat tour in Afghanistan, he had more than a few stories to tell. However, I am immensely sad to say that we lost Tom in a car accident recently. I know, sharing a story with Let's Not Meet seems like a strange way to honor someone's memory. In 2013, Tom's unit was deployed to Afghanistan's Kandahar province. He was a private first class at the time and had been in the Army for a year by the beginning of the tour, with the last several months of that assigned to the 1st Ranger Battalion. He'd gone through immensely difficult training, up to and including jumping out of several perfectly good airplanes to get to where he was now, and as such was eager to finally do his job. He ultimately participated in 19 combat missions during his 4 months in country, all of them night raids aimed at capturing high-value targets, local Taliban cell commanders, or other persons of interest. You see, the Rangers and other special operations forces specialize in nighttime operations. They train at night and operate frequently under the cover of darkness. The Taliban lacked widespread night vision optics, whereas each individual Ranger was equipped with some of the finest NODs money could buy and the accessories to complement them. With that advantage on top of their large numbers and superior training, it was hard for them to not feel like they owned the night when they went out on target. However, this wasn't always the case. One night, Tom's platoon was tapped for yet another HVT raid. After the typical briefing and preparation process, the 30 or so guys boarded the Chinooks and proceeded to the target location, disembarking under the cover of darkness to secure the area. Tom was a member of a 2-man machine gun team. His team leader, Corporal Kyle, manned the M240L machine gun. As his assistant gunner, it was Tom's responsibility to carry spare linked ammunition belts, call out fire adjustments, and act as a bodyguard to the corporal and his weapon should the enemy attempt to flank them. After leaving the chopper, Tom and Kyle moved forward to their designated blocking position, a vantage point in which a fire team can set up and interdict enemy forces attempting to enter or leave a target area. The target in this case was a small village, seemingly abandoned and heavily deteriorated, with crumbling masonry and multiple bombed-out huts. The entire place was incredibly unsettling, showing no signs of life other than a single black cat that slinked amongst the shadows of the buildings. The moon was high in the sky that night, bathing the ramshackle collection of seemingly ancient structures in an eerie light. After ensuring the M240L was set up, Tom surveyed the village. He ultimately focused on a damaged stone wall less than 50 meters away. There was a hole punched out in the center of it, just large enough for a man to stick his head and shoulders through. He watched the hole intently for almost the entirety of the mission, infrared laser lined up, an M4A1 at the ready, expecting the barrel of an AK-47 to appear in it at any moment. It never did. The rifle teams proceeded into the village and searched it from top to bottom, finding no trace of the HVT they were after, or any signs of life at all for that matter. Kyle and Tom relocated to link up with several members of a rifle squad in a large ditch over 100 meters away from the target site. They continued to watch the perimeter as discussions were being held about how to proceed. That's when all hell broke loose. One of the platoon's senior sergeants came running over, yelling at Tom and the other Rangers to get out of the ditch. The comms net exploded with orders to fall back to the LZ for immediate exfiltration. Tom and Kyle were beyond confused. Had EOD picked up on something? Maybe they were all standing atop a buried IED belt, something far from unheard of. The Chinooks double-timed it back to their location and landed, allowing all of the Rangers to board. After a final head count to ensure no one had been left behind, the helicopters lifted off and returned to the airfield. The mission had lasted less than an hour, seemingly ending as soon as it had begun, all without a single shot being fired and no contact with the Taliban, or so Tom thought. After returning to base, the platoon was debriefed and the reason for the sudden scrub of the mission became very clear. Shortly after Tom and Kyle had posted up in the ditch, signals collection specialists attached to the Rangers had picked up enemy radio chatter in the vicinity of the assault force. Very clearly and calmly, the Taliban had spoken. There are 6 men in the ditch. 2 of them are manning a machine gun on the leftmost edge. They are facing the northwest. You can flank them if you follow the berm. They proceeded to list a multitude of details about the assault force and their positions. They were stalking the Rangers, hunting the hunters. Based on the chatter, it was clear that an unknown number of insurgents were setting up a potentially deadly ambush. Other than the intercepted broadcast, the Rangers had been completely unaware of their presence. None of the men on the ground had seen any indication of enemy activity. The trained canines hadn't picked up any scents. The drones and Overwatch aircraft circling the area didn't see a damn thing, even with FLIR thermal vision. Yet the Taliban were listing numerous, meticulous details about the Rangers as if they were standing next to them in the darkness. It was a humbling experience for the entire platoon. For Tom, that mission always sent a shiver up his spine to think about, even though later ops during the same deployment involved full-scale firefights and ambushes.
I was in Iraq in 2006 doing interrogations in support of 5th Special Forces Group. We were located in the southwestern corner of Victory Base Complex. This was the area they called the Radwaniyah Palace Complex because of the absurd number of palaces and other fancy resort-style living arrangements used by Saddam and the Iraqi ruling elite. Our job was to question high-value individuals. This meant we had priority for anyone we thought was more important, influential, or knowledgeable than the average bomb thrower. The idea was that we would do some intensive long-term interrogation, but the reality was pretty disappointing. Everything was pretty mundane and even boring, and by this time, everyone had accepted that there were no stockpiles of WMDs. At the same time, the Iraqis were starting to turn on each other. This was after the Golden Mosque bombing, which basically kicked off the Iraqi Civil War. But that's not what this post is really about. We were looking for a place where we could have an isolated facility for our high-value detainees, where they wouldn't be able to interact with each other or the general population you'd find in one of the larger detention centers. This was back when Cropper and Abu G were still in business. We found a couple of small buildings that looked decent with high walls and enough space for maybe 20 closet-sized cells. One of the places we looked at was this brick building in the middle of the forest. I'm using the term forest loosely, as nothing in Iraq qualifies as a forest the same way you'd think of Washington State or Yellowstone or something. This was just a bunch of trees kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Every night you could see big swarms of bats coming out of the trees from the south. They would fly over the big lake in front of the Radwaniyah palaces and eat the insects. The water was pretty stagnant. Anyway, this forest had a small gray building in the middle of it. It was a round building that was covered in dark marble on the outside, but made of reinforced concrete on the inside. It had a heavy metal gate hidden behind a thick wooden door. At the time, we had no idea what the purpose of this building was. Some kind of storage facility for Saddam's palaces? There were no windows, plumbing, or furniture. We didn't think it was some kind of residence because it looked more like a prison. The EOD guys had already inspected it and found nothing wrong. We had no idea what the building was supposed to be, but we also didn't really care, so we said f*** it, brought in a bunch of plywood and started setting things up. What we ended up with was a large circular room the guards could hang out in, and a second room where we would keep the detainees. Each detainee had their own plywood cell with a foam mattress, a blanket, and a Quran. The place didn't have any plumbing, so the guards would escort the detainees outside to use a porta potty they set up. The MI team had a separate wooden shack where we could run our classified computers and write our reports. It took us like 2 weeks to get everything set up. and then the SF guys started bringing detainees in. Like I said, this was boring work. This was a really shitty time to be in Iraq because the violence was exploding and nobody knew what was going on. Our soldiers weren't trained as investigators, so they tended to just grab anyone they thought looked suspicious and bring them in for questioning. Like, if a bomb went off, they would just snatch everyone on the street and bring them in. Their philosophy was that they were too busy to care who was actually guilty, and the MI guys would sort it all out. We also had an Iraqi SOF team who were supposed to be really, really good. Looking back on it, I'll bet they were basically just a shite hit squad that would target old regime Sunni Baathists they wanted gone. Everything in Iraq was a gang or a mafia or whatever. We didn't really care because they were on our side for the moment and that was good enough for us. So we've been running this place for basically a week when the Iraqi SOF brings in a detainee. I don't remember his name and it isn't important. They accused him of being some high-level Baathist in Saddam's government, and he had been a fugitive since the original invasion. At this point, we were all pretty jaded. Saying someone was part of the Baath regime didn't really mean anything. You could throw a rock in Baghdad and it would probably hit a former regime Baathist. I'm just going to call him Haji. They bring in Haji blindfolded, which was the SOP for transporting detainees. The guards led him, still blindfolded, to the rooms where they took his photo and fingerprints and all that. Then they brought him to the interrogation booth. I call it a booth because that's the generic term army interrogators use for any interrogation space. We just say, I'm going in the booth, or whatever. This particular room was a small space with marble floors and tiles on the walls. Basically everything in these fancy palaces was covered with mosaic tile patterns on the walls. Anyway, they bring Haji into the booth with Sergeant Smith. I'm not going to use his real name for obvious reasons, but it will suffice to know that he was an E6 who transferred in from the infantry. He didn't really know what he was doing. Nobody at that time really knew what we were doing, but he was worse than most. He had been paid an obscene amount of money to reclass into 35M because they were trying to expand the MOS and we were short on NCOs. Sergeant Smith was great at running teams, training weapons, keeping accountability, and all the stuff you would expect an infantry NCO to be good at, but he was freaking useless when it came to anything MI related, so we used him as an administrator and a screener. Sergeant Smith's job was to ask the detainees some basic questions like their name, their religion, their birthplace, and so on. This was all basic background stuff that anyone should have been able to answer without provoking any resistance. Then once we had the basic information down, we would assign the detainee to an interrogator and they would start formulating their strategy. This was basically the extent of the work we could trust Sergeant Smith to do as far as actual interrogations. Anyway, Haji comes in and they take off the blindfold. He takes one look around the room and sees the tile patterns on the walls, and the guy starts screaming. I mean, screaming. I've never heard anything like it. He's absolutely freaking out. Sergeant Smith doesn't know what to do. He hasn't even asked a question yet, but the guy keeps screaming and kicking and thrashing, about to the point we think he's going to hurt himself. Eventually we have to just cancel the interrogation, terminate, and the guards basically drag him out of the room. Of course, this is the start of a total shit show. I should mention that this was post Abu Ghraib, so everyone involved was very anxious about abuse allegations. When they hear about this detainee screaming at the top of his lungs, everyone from the guard commander to the VBC commanding general wants to know what happened. Sergeant Smith, the guards, and the observers all have to give sworn statements. They say they never saw any misconduct. Sergeant Smith didn't touch the guy, didn't even speak to him. Like I said, he just looked at the walls and lost his mind. Eventually, Haji calms down and we try to re-engage the next day. We had to drive him to Cropper because he was going insane being in that building. The interrogators at Cropper let Sergeant Smith go in again, and this time the guy is willing to talk. He claims he was a senior police officer in the Saddam regime, and he knew that building was something called the Hole. He had never been in it before, and he knew that anyone who went in the hole never came out. When he saw what room he was in, he assumed we were about to murder him. So we go back and we ask the guards if they've seen anything weird. We're starting to think this was some kind of execution chamber, so it's possible there's still some evidence of human rights abuses or murders that we could use against Saddam. This was still 2006, so Saddam's trial was in progress. He wasn't executed until December. Some of the guards in the round office tell us the tiles on the floor are loose. Okay, great. Now we have to call in CID to look for human remains or something. But Sergeant Smith doesn't want to wait. He thinks he's cool and wants to do everything himself. So he just starts pulling up the tiles, and we find that there's a false floor with a few layers of plywood covering a hole. And this was pretty new, like definitely installed within the last few years. We're thinking at this point that somebody tried to cover up a mass grave or something during the invasion and hoped the Americans would never find it. The hole itself is basically round and 2 meters wide, and it goes down a long way. Literally, the first thing Sergeant Smith does is break a chem light and drop it down the hole. It falls down so far we can't see the light. There's no splash or echo or anything. It just drops until the light vanishes. So we toss a few more bricks and stuff in there, and there's no sound at all. Sergeant Smith is determined to figure this out. This was before smartphones had high quality cameras, and we didn't have any cameras on hand that we could lower on a rope or anything like that. But Sergeant Smith went to Pathfinder school, and he's really proud of it. He knows how to rappel down, and he's a certified expert at moving equipment on ropes. So he grabs a decently long rope from the Humvee, ties a Swiss seat, and clips himself on. I can't overemphasize how stupid this is, but nobody stops him, so Sergeant Smith starts to rappel down. At first, everything is going great. He talks to us and tells us how it's cold in the hole, but he can't see or smell anything. The rope is at least 100 feet long, tied to the Humvee's trailer hitch outside, so we can't imagine he would abruptly run out of rope. We've got a private sitting in the Humvee in case we need to pull him out quickly. Sergeant Smith keeps going down, and he shouts up to us to tell us he's breaking another chem light. So we wait about 3 seconds, and then he starts screaming. He didn't even have time to tell us what he was scared of. Sergeant Smith just screams, and then he starts screaming in pain. It's even worse than the Haji screaming before. I have no idea what was happening down there. I imagine that's how someone would scream if they were being eaten alive. Now the guards are shouting at the private to get him out of there. He starts letting the Humvee roll forward, and the rope starts coming up. The guard sergeant is standing over the edge of the pit, looking down into the hole while the rope comes up. I should mention at this point that Sergeant Smith did not have a weapon. None of the interrogators did. The guards had nightsticks, but the only weapon allowed in the facility was an M9 the guard sergeant carried. The other weapons were locked up, so everyone is shouting, and Sergeant Smith is screaming down in the hole, and the rope is coming up, but not fast enough. Then the guard sergeant pulls out his weapon and fires 3 shots down the hole. Everything stops. Most people underestimate how loud a gunshot actually is, especially in a small concrete room like that. We can't hear anything, just the squealing sound of early onset tinnitus. But Sergeant Smith isn't screaming anymore. I'm sure of that. The rope keeps coming up, but Sergeant Smith never comes with it. Eventually the rope is covered in blood and black slime. The guards ordered everyone out. I never saw what happened next. To this day, I have no idea what happened. There was a 15-6, then CID got involved, and we all wrote a bunch of sworn statements. They transferred all the interrogators to Cropper, and we were never allowed to speak to the guards again. We weren't from the same unit, so I didn't have much reason to ever interact with them. All I know is what I heard from some buddies in 5th group. The Army brought in demolitionists and did a controlled det that leveled the entire building. They paved over it with a slab of concrete and set up a fence around the site. There were signs telling people not to enter the forest because the bats carried rabies. I never found out what happened to Sergeant Smith. I never saw a copy of the 15-6 or any official determination on the cause of death. I looked up his obituary later and saw it was attributed to a mortar attack. The kind of random thing that could strike anybody for no reason. I also heard the guard sergeant killed himself. I wish I had more answers. I wish I could make this a better story. I just don't know for sure what happened after we left. If anyone else was there, please let me know. The only thing I know for sure, and I put this on all my sworn statements, is that Sergeant Smith wasn't the only person screaming in that hole.